Okay. Well, good morning. If anybody would like to come down closer, you're welcome to. This is we won't call on you. I'm Jack Riggs. I'm a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute, and we have an interesting discussion this morning. Our panelists are, to my immediate left, Senator Jeff Bingaman, chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and in his sixth term, I believe, in the U.S. Senate. Fifth term. And Jim Rogers, who is the chairman, CEO, and president of Duke Energy, one of the longest-serving utility CEOs in the country. And I think you can probably guess that with such seniority in industry and in the Senate, and my being a senior fellow, we hope you won't be disappointed, but we're not going to Twitter during this discussion. Our topic is coal, and specifically clean coal. And before we get into the details of that, and it can be fairly technical, I wanted to try and set the context by asking a question about what might be done about coal in general and about climate change, particularly, Senator Bingaman, in light of the polarization and the apparent inability of Washington to move anything big through Congress. Is there any way we can hope for significant legislation on coal or on climate?
Well, I think there's a way to hope for some modest legislation related to coal and climate, but the president, of course, called for a clean energy standard. I don't know that the support's going to be there, but we're working in the Senate to see if we can get a formulation of that we could get enough people to support. We have passed out of our Energy Committee just this last Thursday some legislation to try to encourage more commercial scales, CCS, carbon capture and storage projects so that we can move that technology forward. So there's a chance for some modest progress legislatively. I think the main thing Congress, I hope, will be able to do legislatively is prevent efforts to weaken the Clean Air Act and defang or deneuter, or neuter, I guess is the right word, the EPA from their efforts to deal with a variety of emissions, but carbon as well.
Mm-hmm. And Jim Rogers, you were an active participant in the U.S. cap effort in the last Congress to try and achieve a cap-and-trade bill. And with the inability of Congress to pass that, a lot of people have said, okay, cap-and-trade is dead. What else can we do? What's your perspective on how we could move forward to put a price on carbon or other ways to deal with climate change?
Well, first of all, I think it's really critical from a policy perspective that we put a price on carbon. We tried hard. We didn't get it across the goal line. I'm an optimist. Many people are saying that cap and trade is dead as a concept. Quite frankly, I don't. I have looked at all the different policy alternatives in terms of how best to put a price on carbon, a cap on emissions, and none of the others have the ability to really allow for kind of the equitable transition to a low-carbon world, given the mix that we have in use of coal across the country. I mean, the stats are pretty clear. 25 states where more than 50% of the electricity comes from coal. And you have to find a way to make the transition in a way that makes sense. So, yes, it's been demonized. It's actually been demonized by Republicans who actually invented it in 1990. And so I have not given up on cap and trade as a way. Now, it won't happen in this session of Congress, but I do believe that there are many things we can continue to do, educate people on it. I don't think carbon taxes work for a variety of political reasons as well as equitable reasons. But I also think, most importantly, we need to turn our focus as we keep pushing and educating people on the need for policy and the need for a price on carbon and a cap on emissions. But we need to really double down on our investment in technology. And that is really one of the keys as we kind of move into the 21st century.
We're going to spend a lot of time on the technology side of CCS, but first I want to go back, Senator Bingham, to your reference to a clean energy standard. Can you say a little bit more about how that could help us deal with carbon in the energy sector and how the renewable portfolio standard may have morphed into a clean energy standard?
Well, I think, most people who followed this debate over the years have known we've tried to put in place a renewable electricity standard or portfolio standard at the federal level. We haven't succeeded. We did report a bill out of the Energy Committee in the last Congress that had in it a renewable electricity standard, a weak one, but a renewable electricity standard. The idea that the President has promoted and that some think is going to work, I think the jury's still out, is to broaden that and cover more sources of generation and try to have a clean energy standard. The President said that we should put in place a standard that would get us to where 80% of our electricity is produced from so-called clean energy sources by 2035. But he included in that natural gas, clean coal, whatever exactly you want to define clean coal as. So the idea is to try to move toward lower emission electricity production, but whether, as I say, I think there's significant difficulties in even getting something like that in place. Jim's right, we're not going to do cap and trade in this Congress. We'll see whether we're able to do one of these other lesser efforts.
Would a lesser effort like that allow Congress to say, okay, we've taken care of this issue, so we don't need to go back to cap and trade?
Well, I don't know. I'm sure that in the minds of some it would. I think my own view would be similar to what Jim's talked about, that we should continue to try to pursue some type of price on carbon that would allow the marketplace somehow to sort out what transition, what mix of fuels we use. And that will not be done by a clean energy standard or a renewable electricity standard, either one, where we specify in law what sort of incentives and limits there are on your ability to produce electricity from different sources. It's much more, a clean energy standard would be more of a command and control kind of a solution than cap and trade, and for that reason, logically, should be more objectionable to people who are more conservative and want less government involvement, but that's not the way it seems to have played out politically.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, when we talk about carbon capture and storage, which today seems to be the main definition of clean coal initially was to get rid of the sulfur and the particulates and the NOx and so on. But now when we talk about clean coal, can you give us just a brief description of what carbon capture and storage means in terms of the plant and the storage?
First, I'd like to come back to the comment that the Senator made, but before I do that, let me answer your question. I don't use the word clean coal. I always talk about cleaner coal because we really have a long way to go for coal to be truly clean. And so, in my judgment, the primary way of doing it is from taking the carbon out of the flue gas, which is in the majority of all the coal plants in this country. And that is a very expensive proposition. The parasitic load is very large, and it's probably the most costly way to extract coal.
Can you define carbon? Parasitic load for?
Yeah, parasitic load is if you have a 600 megawatt unit, for instance, you might have to use 150 megawatts to actually extract the carbon and inject it, and then transport it to where you can actually deposit it. And so we call it parasitic load. So all of a sudden, you now have only 500 megawatts to supply the customers. That means you have to build more generation in order to meet the requirements of your customers. The other approach, and one that we're pursuing in the context of coal gasification, and we're collaborating with Guangdong Group in China on this, is the notion of taking carbon out of the syngas, cheaper alternative than from the flue gas, and then the parasitic load is much lower and consequently lower cost. But it also really allows you, might be a much cleaner way. When we finish our plan, and we can talk more about this in a moment, in Indiana, will be the largest coal gasification plant in the world, but also have the distinction of being the cleanest coal plant in terms of SOx, NOx, mercury, fine particulate, water discharge issues, no ash pond, the way this is set up. It's a remarkable facility on 150 acres. Now, that's sort of the quick definition. But let me come back to what the senator said real quickly. I am really not one that embraces command and control, maybe just because I've been around too long. My memory of the government selecting fuels or selecting technologies, I immediately go back and I think about the Synfuel Corporation, closed, out of business. And then I go back to the Fuel Use Act, 1978, where they outlawed the use of natural gas to generate electricity. Now, Congress did flip that around 7 years later. And then I come back to ethanol, and now we have 40% of the corn in this country being grown for the purposes of ethanol, and the probability that, again, this was the Congress picking a technology and subsidizing it. I just don't think that's a good answer. I still believe in markets. That's why I'm such an advocate for cap and trade. I don't think the history of selecting has been good. Plus, it creates a pretty interesting tension between state commissions who have historically, through integrated resource planning, actually selected what they believe the best alternative is for the consumers of that state. And it varies from state to state. So there's a federal-state tension here that will be generated along that line. And then the details of it, whether God is in the details or the devil, but the details will really matter with respect to what can actually get built on the timeline of any clean energy standard. And that could, by definition, exclude some alternatives. They could have it start so fast that it would exclude nuclear, for instance, just because of the trajectory of how the standard would be deployed. So and this is in the interest of being provocative, I'm kind of reluctant to embrace a clean energy standard just because it is Congress picking a technology, although they say you can use a range of technologies, but how you define the implementation of it could be actually picking a technology.
Mm-hmm. It sounded as though you were leading into a discussion of the inability of the U.S. system right now to demonstrate at large scale the multiple carbon capture and storage technologies, and that may be why it's so necessary to partner with China. But to explore the problem first, Senator, is the fiscal constraint on research and development right now going to prevent us from doing much with carbon capture and storage? Do we have to rely on states like the ones where Jim operates, where there's still a regulated system where you might be able to pass through some of the extra costs of this? The federal government doesn't have much money. How do we get past the research into the demonstration projects? Do we have to go to China to do it?
Well, I think someone suggested we look at that article that Jim Fallows wrote in the Atlantic a few months ago, and I thought it was a very good article. But he made the point, which is obvious, that the Chinese are going to be building an awful lot more coal-fired power plants in the next 10 years than the U.S., and that the opportunity for experimentation and investment and all is greater, and the incentive for them to want to find a way to do these new plants right and with fewer emissions is enormous. So as far as carbon capture and storage, I think that I don't think the federal government is in a position fiscally, and probably shouldn't be in the business either, of trying to subsidize the construction of many of those projects. What we're trying to do, like in the bill we reported out of our committee on Thursday, was to take away some of the potential liability on the first 10 large CCS projects that would be chosen by the Department of Energy, and they'd say, okay, as to these 10, the government will take on whatever risk is involved in anything going wrong as far as the carbon capture and storage project. I think in that way we can encourage more experimentation, more large projects. I think also the actions that the EPA is engaged in now is going to encourage more companies to look at CCS projects as a way to comply with all the regulations and rules that are likely to be coming out. So, but you're right, the fiscal constraints that we face in Washington are very real, and I think Jim referred earlier to the fact that we need to double down on the research that we're doing. Of course, the budget that's come out of the House does just the opposite. I think in applied research, the cut that they propose for next year is 58%. So, that's not doubling down. That's essentially eliminating an awful lot of what you're doing.
Jim, can you talk a little more? I think several American companies are active in China, but I think none as active as Duke in your partnerships. And can you explain in a little more detail how you're pursuing carbon capture and storage through these partnerships?
Sure. We're actually pursuing kind of a wide range of things. Carbon capture, we're primarily working with a Huanan group because they have a project called GreenGen. And in an interesting sense, I kind of watched what we were doing in this country with FutureGen, and it never got off the ground. And then it was shut down, and then it was started up, and it still hadn't got off the ground. And that part of the reason that we moved forward in Indiana is that we have come to call it NowGen. And it was a private initiative. We had some support from both state and federal government to push it forward, but at least we are accelerating the technology. Working with the Chinese, I've come to believe several things, and really very consistent with the senator. They are scaling because they have an economic imperative to provide universal access to electricity. They clearly recognize, as we recognize, that there is a great link between access to electricity and prosperity. So they are on a mission. And as a consequence of that, I believe they are creating what I would characterize as the intellectual property of scaling. In the infrastructure business, that is probably a more powerful intellectual property than even the technology, because it's the ability to scale it. And whether it's carbon capture, and by the way, the Chinese think about carbon capture and storage differently. They view it as a short-term solution until they can actually use the carbon. That's why when we work with ENN, which is one of the largest private Chinese companies, they have a process where you take the carbon out of the flue gas, you use it to accelerate the growth of algae, you use the algae for some biofuel. So they're trying to advance that technology, and they've actually tested it on the back end of some of our coal plants in the Midwest. So the notion that storage is the answer, yes, I think it is an answer, but I think it's been overhyped as the answer. I think it's one of the answers in terms of what you do with carbon when you take it out. I think a more sustainable answer is when you can use it, whether in growing algae or whether you can use it with respect to some carbonate substance that for other purposes. I think the Chinese are really working on that. But the range, and this is a little beyond what we're covering, but we're working with BYD because of batteries and their e-car technology. We're working also with Three Gorges, and State Grid, And so we've kind of have a mix of state-owned enterprises as well as private, mainly because their industry is siloed. And so as a consequence, while we're vertically integrated, they're more siloed. So you have to have a number of relationships in order to participate. But I would underscore this one point. We in the United States don't have the economic imperative because we provided universal access in the 20th century. They will reduce the cost. 24 nuclear plants are building. They lead the world in solar panels. They lead production, lead the world in wind turbine production, building more coal plants and advanced coal plants. So I've come to believe that a mutual collaboration is to the mutual benefit of people of both countries.
Mm-hmm. On the storage side of carbon capture and storage, I think you said, Senator, that your bill last week looks at the liability issue. What are some of the other questions about storage, and in particular, if we actually scale this concept with the huge amount of electricity produced by coal, how much carbon dioxide are we going to be producing, and what kind of a pipeline network is it going to take for us to move it to adequate storage sites?
Well, Jim's more expert than I on this. Obviously, I think some of the big issues are cost. How can you actually capture and store CO2 in a substantial way without pretty dramatically increasing the price of electricity to consumers? You mentioned the pipeline system. A lot of the carbon that is being generated, of course, is not being generated where it could be stored. So you've got to figure out. One of the issues we explored a couple of weeks ago in a hearing is whether or not we need to have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission given authority to cite CO2 pipelines, just as they have authority to cite natural gas pipelines today. How large an investment's that going to be, and is it going to be something that can get done in an effective way? So there are lots of very big issues involved with making CCS the solution. I think Jim's right. There are undoubtedly locations and plants where it can be more readily used than other places, but if you're going to try to sort of clean up our entire fleet of coal-fired power plants by capturing and storing the carbon, you're taking on a major undertaking.
Let me ask both of you, do you see carbon capture and storage as realistic for existing plants, or is that really for new build?
I would think I think it would make more sense for new built plants just because of the cost again. I think it would be extremely expensive to try to retrofit existing plants for effective use of carbon capture and storage. But Jim's undoubtedly looked at this in a detailed way and probably has some insights into it.
I agree with the Senator. I mean, there are limitations on storage both in geology and geography. Clearly in the Midwest, given the nature of the geology and given the amount of coal there and given the number of plants there, that's probably a location where storage might be the preferred solution. But I actually think the way it's going to play out, we have about 300,000 megawatts of coal in the United States. I believe 100,000 megawatts is more than 40 to 50 years old. I believe that all of those plants, at least the way we're planning within our own company, is to shut down all those plants. And I think it'll be by the end of this decade for sure. So one way to go at the CO2 emissions is to shut down this 100,000 megawatts.
Do all of them by the end of this decade?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, you mean the 100,000 that are 40 or 50 years old?
Yes,
okay.
Because here's the way to think about it. Of the 300, 100,000 are very old. It's never made economic sense to retrofit for SOx or NOx or mercury. And in fact, I mean, what we've done is build 2 gas combined cycle, 2 advanced coal technologies, energy efficiency, and solar. That combination is going to allow us to shut down in the next several years 1,600 megawatts of old coal. So when you start to think about it that way, our carbon footprint is reduced on a kilowatt hour basis as a consequence of just modernizing our fleet. And that's with existing technologies. And that's without using CCS. Mm-hmm. But on our plant in Indiana, we have the ability to do between 20 and 40% to capture the carbon, about that percentage from the plant. But I do think it's a mix of shutting down these old plants. It's got to be a critical thing. I mean, I would actually buy into legislation that said plants without SOx, NOx, mercury have to be shut down by time certain. And then leave it to us to figure out, well, how do you replace it? Because I think, one, it's the right thing to do from an environmental standpoint. The second thing is it is the right thing to do from jobs and the growth of our economy. Because if we replace that generation, what you're going to see, and we had a study done by Gordon Rothkopf that basically says for every billion that we spend building new generation, it will create somewhere between 15 and 20,000 jobs, both direct and indirect jobs. So in a sense, forced to shut down those plants, forced to build new generation, not only cleans up the environment, but also is an economic stimulus that the government doesn't fund, that we fund on our balance sheets.
I was just going to ask, I saw that speech that your friend and colleague John Rowe gave at the American Enterprise Institute, where he advocated some of what you're saying, but basically said, look, natural gas is the answer. The government should back away from any mandates and just let the natural course of things occur, and that will mean that we will be replacing big amounts of our coal-fired generation with natural gas. Is there a need for the government to have a concern that in order to keep a mix of sources for energy generation, does the government need to be doing something so that we don't get into a deal where we're, just like today, we're producing too much of our power from coal, perhaps? We could be in the same circumstance with natural gas 20 years from now.
I totally buy into the idea that we could be overly dependent on gas. I mean, this kind of goes back to my history. I remember as a consumer advocate in the 70s sitting in curtailment proceedings trying to allocate who's going to get the gas. And then I remember when it was illegal to burn it. And then I remember the volatility in price. And now we have shale gas, and it's not clear to me whether it's a real or a mirage. A lot of environmental issues, a lot of issues about how many reserves are actually there. I'm a great believer in trying to keep all of, and just on the trajectory we're on, about 30, I think the EIA says 37 to 38% of all electricity will come from gas by 2030. Well, on that kind of trajectory, we would never hit the Waxman-Markey 80% reduction because gas still has 50% of the carbon footprint of coal, and shale gas, depending on how much methane is released, could be 60 to 70%. And if you get hooked on LNG and have to go there, that has 70 to 80% of the carbon footprint of coal. So we have to be very, I'm reserved with respect to it. Now, John Rowe's speech, in our industry, everybody's point of view is a function of where they sit. And John Rowe's a good friend, and we've for 20 plus years. And think about where John sits. He is not building any new plants. No new nuclear, no new nothing. He is in a deregulated environment. He has nothing but nuclear plants. And it's in his interest to see gas prices go up. It is in his interest to see old coal plants shut down because most of his plants are in PJM, which is they call it a deregulated market, but it's a differently regulated market. And in that context, it's huge economic benefits. And in one of his earnings calls, he quantified if the price could move up X amount, how many dollars it would be to him with respect for his company and for his shareholders. So his advocacy is not about building new. It's not necessary. It's more about creating a circumstance where the margin opportunity is greater for his old nuclear plants that will continue to run. And I'm sure John will have an answer to that.
Well, I recall one meeting last fall. It was the Aspen meeting in Washington, where you were making the case for how the customers of coal-burning utilities should not have to suddenly accept a large rate increase because the country decided that we had to impose a price on carbon. And in your advocacy of the Waxman-Markey bill, you and your colleagues were successful in getting a lot of allowances for these coal-burning utilities. And one of your colleagues from a state that had electricity costs for his consumers about twice as high as yours thought that maybe you should look at the absolute cost, not just who has to pay an increase. So there are different arguments about this issue, and Jim is right. Where you stand depends on where you sit.
No, but I'd make an interesting point, though, that I think in the future when we build plants, and this is somewhat controversial within our industry, but I think it should be our practice, is look at the life cycle cost. If you take a life cycle cost look at gas plants or coal plants or nuclear plants or wind or solar, it might be a better way to do the analysis in terms of what you pick. Because at the end of the day, we have to provide electricity that's affordable, reliable, and clean, and we have to balance those competing goals. And I've come to believe, at least at this time in history, with this amount of technological development, there is no perfect solution. So getting the solution right is really key. And to your point, I just make the small point that in every time I ever testified before Congress, and I did many times, I always started my conversation by saying, I'm here for one purpose, to make sure my customers who carried out national policy in the late 70s to wean themselves from oil, when almost 20% of the electric generation in this country came from oil. We built coal plants, we built nuclear plants, and gas was prohibited. We had no choice. And that for the national policy to shift, that we shouldn't be punished for carrying out national policy in the 70s and 80s. And Jack, you wrote most of that along with others. So we shouldn't be punished for that. And it's not punishing our company, it's really punishing our customers. And I always made the argument that I'm here on behalf of my customers, not my shareholders.
Mm-hmm. And your grandkids. Don't forget your grandkids.
Yeah. And there are a lot of them.
You mentioned the affordability of electricity. Clearly, to have a clean energy economy, all of the cleaner technologies are more expensive right now. If we have to put carbon capture and storage on coal plants to continue to burn coal, solar is now more expensive. Wind in some areas is not, but it needs backup. Can we continue to tell electricity consumers that we're going to protect them against higher prices? I ask you both as a utility executive and you as an elected official. Or do we need to start educating them the price of energy has to go up?
Let me give my senator ground cover by simply saying from an industry perspective, I mean, the real price of electricity has been flat for 50 years. Pretty remarkable fact. In the next 20 to 30 years, a real price of electricity is going to go up dramatically. Even if there wasn't carbon regulation, we're going to have to retire and replace these plants. Our nuclear plants, I don't believe in extending the license beyond 60 years. We'll start in our company alone in 2030 and in the country in 2019 to start to shut down nuclear plants. Nuclear today has 70% of the carbon-free electricity comes from nuclear plants in our country. So all of those are going to have to be replaced just to kind of tread water. So the reality is, and I say this in every meeting, the real price of electricity is going to go up dramatically. That's why I'm an advocate for energy efficiency, because I want to help consumers control their bills. And that's why I'm an advocate for clarity in terms of what to build. because we're going to build something. So the question is, what? And that is really the tough challenge.
Senator, do you have a thought on how we could educate?
Well, I think part of the price of not just electricity, but gasoline for automobiles, all of the price of energy generally, I think, is going to be going up. And it's sort of an interesting synergy in that you have to deal with that. You have to promote efficiency, more efficiency in the use of energy, and to a very great extent, the increased price causes you to be more efficient. So I think that that was one of the debates which was always sort of below the surface of all the cap and trade discussion. I mean, the truth was, there was going to be an increase in the price of electricity, and as part of that, and that was going to drive less demand, and that was a good thing. I mean, that would prevent us from having to build so many of these power plants and allow us to shut down more without having to replace them.
At last night's session, I'm not sure whether either of you heard it, Bill McKibben, who has left, made the case that we should not build any more coal plants, and we should not open leases in the Powder River Basin, that in fact we cannot make coal clean in the foreseeable future, so we should stop burning it. And I know, Jim, in your case, you got some opposition when you decided to build a new coal plant, even though it was substantially cleaner than the old ones. How much did the protest influence your decision? How did your regulators look at it? And Senator, how does your committee look at those kinds of questions? And looking at coal, it's not just carbon; it's mountaintop removal. It's a whole series of other issues.
Well, I guess the way I would. We in Indiana had very little opposition to building it. We had one group several groups came together that were very vocal, but at the end of the day, because Indiana is a large coal producing state also, they recognized if we could find a way to use a new technology to allow us to use coal in a clean way, that was a good solution for the state from an economic standpoint. Not only do you create jobs in the mining part of the state, but you're also creating jobs when you're building this new facility. And that's proved to be a very good thing during this very tough recession. In North Carolina, the opposition was much greater. I had coal dumped in my front yard on Christmas Eve. I had people put posters all over my house on the outside of it. People chained themselves to the front door of our offices. So there was a lot of opposition. But at the end of the day, I comforted myself with the belief that I'm building an 800-megawatt coal plant, but I'm shutting down 1,000 megawatts in North and South Carolina. I'm eliminating ash ponds. I'm eliminating water usage, particularly on the Catawba watery basin. And so I believe net, it was a good bridging strategy going forward. My answer with respect to should we just not build any more coal and shut down all the existing coal plants, and we could do that. But would it really advance the cause? Because I guarantee you China's not going to stop. India's not going to stop. Certain countries in South America are not going to stop. And climate's a global problem. And for us just to say, no, we're not doing any more coal, that would be a problem. Now, I grew up in Kentucky. I know about mountaintop mining, and I'm against it. And so what we do is we use very little mountaintop mining in the Midwest. In the Southeast we do, but we've made a commitment that if we can get coal at the same price as mountaintop mining, we won't buy mountaintop mining coal, but we went to our regulators and worked this out. Now, would I pay a premium for other than mountaintop mining? The regulators weren't prepared to go there because, again, one of their responsibilities is make sure we have low-cost rates.
Senator, do you have any thought on whether we can?
Well, just the point that Jim's making that there are going to be many hundreds of coal plants constructed worldwide over the next decade or two, and perhaps beyond that. And I think it's very much in our interest to be in a position to try to ensure that the best possible technology goes into those coal plants, and we can make a contribution in that regard, I think. So I think for us to just take ourselves out of the game in the sense of saying we are no longer going to consider coal regardless of where the technology leads, I think it's a little bit like what Germany's just announced with their nuclear fleet. They're going to shut it all down, and so they're. I mean, I don't know that either of those decisions is wise when you look at it in the context of the overall planet.
And the German situation is really quite unique because they already have problems in terms of the amount of wind they have in solar, and at night having to actually cycle down their coal plants and cycle down their nuclear, and they're actually building coal plants in in Germany. And their average rate is about 40 cents a kilowatt hour, while the average rate in the U.S. is 10. So again, I keep coming back to the mantra of balancing affordability, reliability, and clean. And that's why a portfolio really gives you a better ability to try to achieve as much as possible each of those three goals.
I understand that even some utilities in the U.S. sometimes, to meet the state portfolio standard, when the wind blows at night, they have to cycle down the coal plant. Then it takes several hours to cycle it back up in the morning, and they may miss that peak load and have to buy expensive purchase power. Economically, it's not working.
Actually, when you cycle up and down gas plants or coal plants, you actually produce more CO2 in terms of the cycling process. So you're better to keep it on and running than cycling it up and down. So not only does it produce more emissions, but it also is more costly.
And it wears out the plant more
Yes.
quickly, I guess, yeah. Do either of you want to venture a guess as to how much coal we'll have in our mix? Maybe you in your system, Jim, and maybe nationally, Senator, say in 2030, will we still be at 50% of our electricity coming from coal?
I'm not expert enough to predict. I think it's like my guess is that because of the retirements that are being driven both by the low price of natural gas and by the regulatory actions of the EPA under the Clean Air Act, I would expect us to have substantially less than that in the mix by 2030, you asked about. That'd be my guess.
I think EPRI, as well as EIA, still thinks it'll be roughly in the high 40s, right around 50. Probably as you're in that area. But the thing that's hard to factor in is what's really happened. And we talked about this last night. In 2007, we will not get back to a 2007 sales level to 2015 because of the economy. The deep recession, the very anemic recovery. As a consequence, that's great news from a carbon emission standpoint because we bought some time. But it also may have significant implications on how much the load will actually grow by 2030, and that will have implications. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to predict. I actually believe that in the long term for me at my age is 2050. Although there's a chance I can live to that long. Jack, my great-grandfather lived to be 104.
Terrific.
And I'd be a little younger. But I actually believe by then nuclear will trump coal, notwithstanding the incident in Japan. And we'll have much more nuclear than we do coal. And I believe solar will trump wind because it has a distributed nature. And so I will be around to see if that prediction comes true. But I actually believe that we will build less coal, build more nuclear, build more solar, build less wind. And I say that as a guy who has spent $1.7 billion and has over 1,000 megawatts of wind and solar, and predominantly wind.
You know, we mentioned a couple times the EPA regulations under the Clean Air Act, which may come down quickly, may be phased in more slowly. I know people in the industry have expressed concern that if they come down quickly, coal plants might have to be shut down quickly, and how will we replace that capacity? What's the worst case from your perspective, Jim, in terms of EPA action quickly with short deadlines, and how would the industry respond?
I think that, again, it's a function of where you sit. I mean, we started down the road of modernization back in 6, 7, and 8. And as a consequence of that, we're going to be prepared to shut down 1,500 to 1,600 megawatts of plants. So, and so for us, I mean, we would like to see the EPA go from 3 years to 5 years. It gives us a little more flexibility. But there are some proposing that they should delay everything to 2020. I'm not in that camp. I actually believe sooner is better. And we prepared ourselves to shut down these plants. And because I think in the long term that it's the right strategy to not, and we actually have starved from a capital standpoint some of these real old plants. They're almost fully depreciated. And the notion is, what a great opportunity to reduce our emissions footprint. And I'm as worried about SOx, NOx, and mercury as I am carbon, because, I mean, all of them are equally important for us to reduce. And so I'm a supporter of where the EPA is going, and the only change I would make is just maybe a little longer, because not everybody has built as much as we have during this period and are in a position to shut down as many plants.
Will Congress let EPA set an early deadline?
Well, I think my own view is that the current Congress, there are not enough votes to override a presidential veto in the current Congress. And I assume the president will back up whatever decision EPA makes as far as the timelines go, so that the president would exercise a veto if there were some effort by Congress to override EPA. So I can't tell you about what the next Congress might bring, but this current Congress, I think, will at least have enough votes in it to sustain a presidential veto if that's required.
Is this the kind of issue that could conceivably be attached to a debt ceiling bill or a budget bill of some kind? EPA cannot spend any money to do such and such?
Yeah, that's undoubtedly a strategy that will be looked at and tried. And again, it comes down to who feels more strongly about the issue, and is the president willing to say, I'm not going to let you load up a debt ceiling extension with this unrelated issue.
Well, let me turn to the audience and see if you have questions. The one thing I would like to ask, though, is there's another session this afternoon, a plenary session that both of these panelists will be in, and that's a broader discussion of energy. So to the extent we can, I'd like to see if we can keep this to coal so we don't steal their thunder this afternoon. I don't know if we have mics here, but yeah, if you'll go to the mics and we'll call on you in order.
There's one right over here.
There's one in this aisle and this aisle. You're first.
Hi, I'm Paul Dietz with Westar Energy. Really enjoyed the conversation that you had. Something that didn't come out last night was the reason that Bill wasn't able to stay for this meeting is he's going to, I think, join a protest to try to prevent a lot of Powder River Basin coal from being exported. What didn't come out was if they manage to get that exporting going on, it's going to put price pressure on the PRB coal, and as a result, a lot of our fuel costs are going to be rising. At the same time, the prescription of let's take out our old plants and start building new plants is certainly going to expand our rate base, and it's certainly going to raise prices. So my concern here is, I'll call it the Medicaid effect, or I'm sorry, the Medicare effect. What happens when a number of older people, retirees, people on fixed income are faced with dramatically rising bills, as a rate or as a consequence of increased rates. And what might that have? What effect might that have on Congress?
I think the most important thing we can do, and I've been an advocate for 5 or 6 years now, in a more aggressive way, is to really pour more and more money, and a utility is uniquely positioned to do it with a low cost of capital, more and more money into the other side of the meter and try to get productivity gains in the use of electricity so that you mute the price increase that is inevitable. So I think that is a very important thing. And if we manage this right and smooth out the cost impacts, and maybe part of the answer is going to formula rates, so rather than have 15% type increases every so many years, you smooth it out with 2-3% increases. I think those type of approaches are really, from a customer perspective, for industrials, a better way to plan. For residentials, you mute the cost impact. I might say, just as a piece of history, when I was a lawyer in Washington, I worked on a cold slurry pipeline out of the Powder River Basin to export it to China. To export it to Japan.
You want to comment on that?
I can't think what to add to what Jim said.
Okay. Let's take one question over here.
Okay. My question is a context question for Senator Bingaman. Okay. I'm working on a book called Mother Earth, Father, Son, Anabolic Needs of Biota. And I'm Dinesh from Flagstaff, Arizona. And my question is this. Is there, at this time, any a viable advocacy for hydrogen fusion in Congress?
Viable advocacy, is that what you asked about?
Yes. Is there?
I don't think there is. I think that I don't know of any great initiative that relates to that's going forward, at least on the Senate side.
Okay, another question here.
Hi. Could either of you speak to the significance of the Green Gen project for advanced coal technology in both the U.S. and China? And also, a question for Jim Rogers. I'm curious what the obstacles are between what needs to happen both economically, politically, and technologically to actually install a carbon capture and storage system at the Edwardsport plant?
Well, let me jump on the Edwardsport first. I think that, we're learning a very valuable lesson, and this is why the government should be more involved in scaling. But we've taken the risk as a private company, and also our consumers are taking a risk, because we started out thinking the plant would cost $2 billion, and anytime you scale a technology, you can't predict the design changes that will occur. And so now the plant is going to cost us roughly $2.9 billion. So there's been an increase in cost. But we've also designed it in a way to actually do carbon capture there between 20 and 40%. And we're actually starting to do some engineering work around that. At the end of the day, what we'll probably do is go to the government, to the DOE, and see if they will play the lead role in making that happen. Because in the U.S., we had FutureGen, and it really has never moved forward. And it is comparable to GreenGen in China, which has actually moved forward, and they've made real progress. And that plant comes online, I think, in 12. And so, again, we're chattering a lot about it, and the Chinese are actually doing it. Our government has done nothing in terms of coal gasification, and we in the private sector have really stepped up. Now, to get the carbon capture part, our customers are taking we've tried to control the price increase to 16%. It could have been 19% at the higher prices. But for them to wear all the costs of the CCS, when there is no major CCS from a syngas stream in the U.S., I just think this is an ideal place for the government to invest. Now, whether they have the capability to invest is a huge, huge question. And it's so depressing from my perspective to know that the House has cut an already skinny R&D budget in the energy area, that is not a good sign for the ability for our country to compete in the future.
Do you want to comment on that?
No, it's good.
Okay. Over here.
I'm curious, when you talk about mountaintop removal, even coal plants, what concern is there for risk mitigation? The fact that more and more research is showing the damage that it's doing to people's health, people's lungs, the communities where mountaintop removal is happening. How do you look at those costs because it is a risk, it's a liability also for your company? How is that being considered?
I think first, it is not legally a risk, mountaintop mining for our company. It is for those that actually mine the coal, those companies. However, as I said to you before, and we had a long discussion at my annual meeting on this, but I grew up in Kentucky. I've seen what mountaintop mining can do to a community and to the land. I think at the end of the day, we need to find a way to curtail it or eliminate it. I strongly believe that. And as a consequence of it, we tried to work with our regulators to see if we could walk away from mountaintop mining, but at the end of the day, they didn't buy that as a solution, but they allowed us to move away from it if we could find cost parity. Now, another way to negotiate this is let us pay a 10% premium, because our rates in North and South Carolina are 30% below the national average, and so that would be a good answer. But I believe, and this really gets back to a point I made earlier, if you do life cycle analysis of building a coal plant and some of that coal is going to come from mountaintop removal, then the math looks fundamentally different than if you just look at the math of building the coal plant and not taking into account the externalities associated with the mountaintop mining.
You know, to supplement that point, and this is going to sound like a commercial for Duke, and I don't mean it that way, but we had a meeting here at Aspen a few years ago where we got a disparate group of people together to talk about some of the trade-offs between the environment and the economy and how different sectors handle it. We had some elected officials, we had some people from the press, we had some business leaders, we had some environmentalists, some others I'm forgetting. And at the end of the day, the discussion seemed to narrow down to the question about how much can a corporate leader be expected to do if his competition isn't doing it, given that the principal responsibility is a fiduciary one to the shareholders. And I think Jim kind of led the group to an understanding that it's unfair to ask one utility or one oil company or one chemical company to impose a higher environmental standard on their own facilities if they're going to lose business, lose shareholder revenue by doing it. On the other hand, it's perfectly legitimate, and maybe we should expect corporate leaders to advocate for the kinds of national regulations or rules that would require the competitors to do it too. Then they're not hurting their company. And that's where I think Jim and a few other corporate leaders have tried to bring the national standards to a level that everyone might have to meet so they don't have to worry about hurting their shareholders when they help the environment.
And actually said another way, it's really trying to help. And since 2000, corporate leaders, after Sarbanes-Oxley, have been really reluctant to stand up and address public issues. And that's a great failure for our economy and for public policy in our country. If you leave it to the U.S. Chamber or the Business Roundtable or the Business Council or some of these other groups, at the end of the day, it's the lowest common denominator. So I'm a great believer in the power of one person or one company to really lead on the policy and drive it. And I think that is really needed in this country now from the corporate sector more than ever before.
Okay, another question here.
Hi, I'm Jesse Morris from the Rocky Mountain Institute. We've been talking, obviously, clean coal and everything. We're talking a little bit more about supply-side solutions. I was going to just ask a little bit of a probing question. Could you give us some insight? It's a two-part question. First part, why has CCS and cleaner coal technologies really gotten more face time and kind of some press interest than really proven demand-side approaches like residential and commercial energy efficiency? And part two is, let's say we did have some of those energy efficiency mandates in regional or federal policy. Could that be tied into a clean energy standard, or would it have to be separate legislation?
I'll let you take this.
Well, I don't know that I have any great insight. I guess there's an energy efficiency standard separate and apart from a clean energy standard that has been bandied about and talked about, and we have some people who are advocating that we try to include that as part of it. We had, in fact, part of the renewable electricity standard we reported out of our committee in the last Congress was, in fact, a energy efficiency standard rather than because you could get credit for that. And we've thought about if there's a clean energy standard enacted, would we also provide some kind of credit for effective demand reduction efforts and improved efficiency. I agree with you. It gets for some reason just the way the mind operates, I guess, or the human condition. People don't seem to take as much of an interest in demand side reduction and efficiency improvement as they do in some of the larger supply side solutions, such as carbon capture and storage.
Well, and the regulatory system may have something to do with that too.
But most importantly, it's the math, because the average is of the electric bill, the disposable income of a family is about 1.9%. Their cell bill is bigger, their cable bill is bigger. So in a real sense, it is not as a compelling economic driver in terms of the wealth. But your other point is something I've reflected a lot on about why was CCS hyped, got more airtime, I think is the expression you used. As I look back on it, NRDC really supported it, EDF really supported it, and the reason they really put it in the spotlight and really said, yes, that's the answer, because they thought that would really bring along remember 50% of our electricity comes from coal, bring along the coal industry, because they're saying there is a solution and we can use coal. I'm a little cynical because what we're learning is CCS is a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive. They kind of glossed over all that because they wanted to drive climate change through. And so there was a reason to hype CCS without, I mean, think about it. We've been so slow to fund it or to develop it or to really understand the true cost or how to do storage and how to make it really work. I know the senator's doing great work in trying to define the liability and other issues, or maybe even FERC, eminent domain type of legislation. But the reality is the environmentalists seized on it, hyped it, because they wanted to be able to say there is an answer for coal, so let's go on and have a price on carbon and capital emissions.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions, and we have two more people standing, so let's go here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is John Stahura. I'm a senior associate professor of biology. I teach environmental courses at Manor College near Philadelphia. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, and in my early years, I couldn't help but notice the damage left behind, the legacy left behind by strip mining, especially. And you could still fly over or drive around areas of northeastern PA and see the legacy of that. We have polluted streams in many spots, mainly from mine acid drainage that went out into streams as they pumped water out of the mine. So that, I haven't heard the water issues addressed yet. Also, as a follow-up to Kerry's question, I don't think I heard an answer to it, and that is about the risk of coal power plants to public health. Thank you. That's to either panelist.
Well, I think, first of all, since I answered it, I thought I was answering her question, and I apologize if I didn't. But I think when I said taking in the life cycle cost of a coal plant and all the externalities really addresses exactly your point. I believe that needs to be done, and I think it's critical. And with respect to you look at northeastern Pennsylvania, and then you compare it to other areas where strip mining has occurred, or surface mining, basically the rules and regulations have changed dramatically since the early days when they mined that part. And so the environmental requirements are fundamentally different today in those areas. Are they good enough? I don't know that answer, but they're fundamentally different. If you go to western Kentucky, for instance, and you look at surface mining there compared to what happened in the much earlier day in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Okay, do you want to say anything to that? No. Okay, last question.
My name is Gang He. I'm a research associate at Stanford University program on energy and sustainable development. We have a research platform on global coal market. Our observation on CCS and in China is that China do have the interest on this technology, and but China's core interest on energy efficiency, energy security, or cheap energy for its economy development argues directly against large-scale deployment of CCS in China, except all this funded by outside funding. So what do you see the international financial mechanism for doing CCS at scale in China? And I also appreciate your mention of China's interest on carbon utilization, but this might be small compared to the capacity or we need to do CCS. What do you see the real potential for carbon utilization? Thanks.
I think that one of the reasons that China doesn't see CCS as a total solution has to do a little bit with the geology in China in terms of the capability to store it. I think one of the efforts that's being made in Australia with the prior prime minister is to really create a gasification and CCS institute. And so there's a lot of money being invested there and research done to really see if we can make it work. So my belief is, with respect to China, that they're going to push hard on CCS. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't make total economic sense, it is not going to be a solution for them, mainly because they have this I don't know how to describe it, but they're on a mission. They got to provide access to every family, every business. That is an economic imperative in terms of the growth of the country, building the middle class. So virtually that is going to trump most things. But even there, if you look at the 12 5-year plan, they're putting tremendous emphasis on CCS as well as a range of other greener technologies going forward. And they have the ability, as I said earlier, to scale them. And that's a huge differentiator from the ability of Europe or the ability of the U.S. or any other part of the world. No other part of the world can scale it like China can, and that's where they make a huge contribution on these evolving technologies.
Okay, thank you. I think our time is up, and I think the schedule now shows that if you want to go back to the Door Hosier building for lunch, then you'll have an opportunity to hear another session.